Oh hi, I'm the heretic. What do you know of Socrates, dear viewer? Well, as is fitting with the man who claimed that the only thing he knew was that he knew nothing, our knowledge of him is limited. If he ever wrote anything, nothing has survived to the present day that I know of, and what does exist are the surviving writings of his contemporaries and disciples, second-hand accounts basically, of his work and his interactions with many of the schools of thought present in ancient Greece. Today, we're taking a critical look at his primary technique for challenging these schools of thought. We're looking at the Socratic method. To review, the Socratic method is a dialectical technique based on two or more people asking questions to each other. They communicate their differing perspectives to check for consistency within the other's internal reasoning, including with their own beliefs and understandings. I frame it as competing perspectives because of how cognition works. Let me explain. You receive sense data, sound waves in the air, light rays in your retina, you get the idea. Inputs to your nervous system from the environment that you receive constantly. The brain then represents the stimuli as data, making certain corrections as needed. For example, the eye is structured for perception of light as upside down. Cognition then compares this sense data to existing data sets, creating data structures that form the basis of knowledge within one's memory. Perception then emerges as a generalization of stimuli within one's environment, perception being a purely mechanical process in the brain that causes an experience of said stimuli to emerge. I say all that to present my meaning of perception and experience, especially as it relates to the Socratic methods and topics I will be elaborating upon later. Now, you've likely experienced the Socratic method in your life, moments where you needed to correct someone or they tried to correct you. It's an everyday occurrence of technique employed to bring participants and onlookers closer to the truth. But what is meant by the truth? To Socrates, the truth is a universal perspective of any concept, a method of understanding and articulating the properties of a topic that is always correct, independent of perception, context, space, or time. Virtue, piety, good versus evil, all were topics he debated at length to cultivate an understanding that was closer to the truth that Socrates is credited with exploring. However, as a generalized concept, the Socratic method would not be limited to just those ideas. It can explore other concepts like math, emotions, color, or language. Even topics in the natural sciences like mass or magnetism. Truth itself isn't immune to scrutiny. By exploring these concepts through discourse, participants are said to move closer to discovering the universal perspective, or to discern gaps in understanding, but one could argue that being relieved of one's ignorance of their own ignorance is a step towards achieving the universal perspective. In other words, removing the unknown unknowns. Said perspective must be exposed to the filter of narrative, such that it can be communicated or understood. This happens since any perspective must first be interpreted as sense data, as I described earlier. Structurally, no two brains are alike. Even identical twins achieve diverging neural patterns through neuroplasticity. The mind that emerges from the brain forms from context developed over life experiences no two individuals could share, the better to adapt to unique environmental pressures. The heterogeneity of neurology creates the technical conditions for forming unique perceptions. To compare new knowledge to old knowledge and form unique data sets that change over time. After all, people are constantly experiencing new sense data. As I described in my video, Your Constitutional Right to Free Pudding, any information experienced by a consciousness is filtered through one's own perception. The result is a narrative about one's environment or reality forming from unreplicable circumstances. We know it can't be replicated because to replicate the narrative would require traveling back in time. We know that time is a variable of circumstance. If it weren't, then nobody would have perceived the measurement of time as important enough to invent clocks. What this all means is that it's all well and good if someone does hypothetically learn the universal perspective utilizing the Socratic method, but within one's internal reasoning, the truth will only be conceptualized as perspective. Said perspective has to be able to be evaluated against the subject of the truth in order for the universal nature of said perspective to be evaluated. Said evaluation must also hold within itself the property of truth for the original property of truth to be identified. This, in turn, must also be evaluated in order to be— oh god damn it, this is an infinite regress. I barely even started the video yet! Anyways, let's just ignore that. To be properly understood, truth must have a universal perspective about itself. Hold on. For universal perspectives to function, they need a universal perspective. That's a tautology, frickin' hell! So, since Socrates believed he could arrive at the truth through his dialectical method, he expected a universal perspective about the truth not only existed, but could be communicated. Therefore, universal perspectives about other concepts must not only exist, but could be communicated as well. What this entails is that for Socrates, there is a true way, or a correct way, to experience something, or a correct perspective regarding the subject. Its trueness is revealed through discourse and can conceptually be understood through a method of internalizing information in a correct way. Now, allow me to introduce the dark triad of philosophy. The name references the dark triad, listing personality traits inclined towards behavior destructive to others. The dark triad of philosophy works in a similar manner. Its three concepts that, if held within one's logical framework, constrain their ability to develop a narrative about reality and their personal relationship to it to a set of externally defined rules. However, it is a cognitive trap. No coherent theory of knowledge is attainable within it, as it lacks any way for demarcating reasoning from hallucination. I'll be exploring all of these points. What Socrates does is introduce the first of the 3 points of the dark triad of philosophy I will be discussing: objectivism. Now, just to clarify, by objectivism, I am not referencing the philosophy of Ayn Rand. Though Randianism does appeal to universal perspective on concepts like property or morality, I do mean to distinguish Randianism from objectivism as I will be using it. I am using these terms to describe a metaphysical framework from which a universal perspective emerges, sometimes called universality or objectivity. Just know that when I say objectivism, I am not identifying Randianism. While describing Socrates' concept of the truth as a universal perspective, I did so from a rule set external to the universal perspective. Doing so broke its coherency like brittle glass. For objectivism's universality to matter, there has to be a universal perspective that internalizes a universal narrative. For the narrative itself to matter, and to avoid being misinterpreted, there has to be a universal experience everybody undergoes when exposed to the universal narrative. Said universal experience must, itself, hold a universal narrative within itself as context to be identified. Thus, the objective perspective is contrasted against incorrect perspective by its truthness. Yet no method of evaluating truthness is known to me that references any concept outside of itself. It is as though simply knowing if any given narrative is the truth provides all the data necessary for anyone to be able to perfectly reconstruct the objective definitions and descriptions of the subject within one's own mind, as well as necessary means to be able to communicate the universal perspective to another. For this to function, a universal means of communication must exist that bypasses ambiguities or subjective experiences in meaning, language, context, or disability. After all, it's difficult for deaf people to hear you, for instance. Not only does this mean truth is an intrinsic quality of any subject, but this implies information about the nature of intrinsic qualities themselves, namely, their ability to communicate their properties independent of context, circumstance, or even a medium of information transfer. Truth, therefore, would have to be a cognitohazard, the experience of which imprints itself upon the minds and perceptions of those who encounter it in repeatable patterns. However, any intrinsic quality cannot be identified without appealing to objectivism, being that for an entity or information to have truthness, said truthness must tautologically refer to itself. This is because entities can only exist in relation to other things. The properties of things are also entities, with properties that can only be studied by contrasting their differences. As truth is the core concept that allows it to emerge, objectivism cannot refer to anything outside of itself to demonstrate its own validity. We know the truth is true because it's true, does not present an idea that can be studied or scrutinized, and anyone can demonstrate this through language alone. Objectivism appeals to an infinite regress, which eliminates the subject from study by eliminating any possibility of difference. Evaluation requires reference to something external, which in the case of the Socratic concept of truth itself cannot occur. One cannot get around this by saying that objectivism is sometimes correct. Only some entities have intrinsic truth. Consider what this line of inquiry would entail. One would have to figure out when Socratic truth is or is not correct about a topic, evaluate the criteria for that, evaluate the evaluation, boom, we're back in an infinite regress, just with an extra step. Even the null hypothesis of truth, untruth, falls into the same problem as it still operates within a rule set of objectivism. Untruth creates a universal perspective as well, it's just one that added not to the narrative. Though I want to direct your focus away from objectivism as a metaphysical framework for knowledge, consider objectivism as a function. Let me explain. If there were to be an objective perspective on subjects, what that would mean is that there is only ever one perspective on any subject, the objective perspective. The properties of truth, as a cognitohazard I described earlier, means anyone who is exposed to the truth will only ever have the objective perspective. Because there is only one ontologically correct narrative about a given subject, one that is universally understood and internalized, it would mean that anyone who is ignorant of the truth would learn it immediately through simple exposure to the universal perspective. Thus, comparing perspectives would never occur, since everybody would eventually hold the exact same perspective. Since communication is a function for comparing perspectives, if everyone holds the same perspective about a subject, or theoretically all subjects, then communication wouldn't happen. The only reason communication would then ever occur is when somebody is lying about any subject of the universal perspective. They must be lying teleologically because the universal perspective is perfectly transmissible, meaning ignorance, misunderstanding, or miscommunication couldn't emerge. But we already know that a universal perspective is not conceptually valid. Those who fall into objectivist frameworks of logic conform their thinking to the rules I described. As such, once a person hallucinates that they discovered the truth, they will begin to evaluate information based on the framework that led them to the truth in the first place. Within their own internal reasoning, they cannot compare the conclusions they've reached. Why do so when it is already correct after all? More importantly, objectivism constructs a teleological rationale for presupposing the motivations of someone with a competing perspective. They're lying. I know they're lying because I told them the truth and they didn't believe me. Their ego projects their hallucinations onto the environment while framing those with differing perspectives as adversaries. Because it is argued that there is only one way of understanding the environment, there is only one way of understanding the relationship between oneself and the environment. This is the function of objectivism, to create the perception within those who utilize it that there is only one perception, to appeal to the ego, to make one believe that their perception is ontologically correct, and to create a hallucination about the motivations of people with competing perspectives, and finally, to imply a static rule set regarding the environment and what meaning can emerge from it. Here, objectivism implies the second point on the dark triad of philosophy, materialism. Materialism is the philosophical school that posits matter to be the fundamental substance in nature, substance theory being the belief in ontology that all objects are amalgamations of a substance, the distinction between objects being patterns recognized by certain combinations. Within its internal reasoning, this explains why atoms can be a separate and distinct concept from chairs, yet the chair can be made of atoms. Advances in materialist philosophy that incorporate modern understandings of physical forces exist, so it's not uncommon for someone to encounter physicalism or physicalists when researching the subject. Physicalism is just updating classical materialism to incorporate energy, space-time, exotic matter as being contributors to physical forces identified in nature that were otherwise ignored by materialist philosophers who often created their philosophy before these newer theories even existed, entirely due to lack of information, not omission, just to be clear. While classical materialism does specify matter as a substrate, the nature of the substrate is not the focus of my examination. I will use the term materialism to describe metaphysical concepts held within traditional materialism as well as physicalism. But I digress. Materialism, cause and effect, are presented as occurring according to a multitude of purely physical process and interactions all referred to as natural laws, not to be confused with the concepts in natural law theory. Natural law refers to a legal positivist theory regarding interpersonal relations. The natural laws are supposed to explain every action, reaction, or emergent property in nature. How each physical state resulted from a chain of events stretching back to the beginning of time. The expression of the materialist understanding of cause and effect is said to emerge from its alternatives, events emerging without cause or causing themselves, as false. This constructs a teleological problem, as it presents validity of a concept through its end, that being that these other concepts are false. They're false only in the objectivist sense, but we've already explored that. Anyways, the teleological problem is that within materialism's own internal reasoning, cause and effect has no definable characteristics external to itself that causes it to emerge, or even identifiable circumstances. That's not to say that cause and effect is invalid, just that within materialism, there's no ability to represent it in relation to anything else. What can be framed teleologically is random, because the characteristics that caused it are undefined, even if it represents something that could be a function. That is to say, within materialism, we know what cause and effect is, but we don't know what causes cause and effect. That aside, causality is claimed to emerge from natural laws, and it is because of them that all events to occur are supposed to be inevitable and constrain all probabilistic events to a single course. Future events are said to be able to be predicted with perfect accuracy only by studying the chain of cause and effect leading up to it. The technical requirements to make such predictions are significant to say the least. One needs not only a perfect understanding of the natural laws, but must have perfect knowledge of all energy in the universe and the current state of any unit of energy at any given moment in time. While no serious thinker would genuinely consider this to be something achievable with known technologies and techniques, that it is still conceptually possible is what makes its identification notable. What I described is similar to Laplace's demon, except describing energy rather than matter and matter's momentum. To be clear, I know that a complete framework for what these natural laws are does not exist. I do not expect that anybody unironically believes they do either. For this reason, I consider these laws in the abstract, rather than scrutinizing their rules directly. If I did, this video would be about physics or chemistry. The problem is conceptual, metaphysical, rather than physical. To place everything within a chain of cause and effect, including itself, materialism has to prescribe everything as composing some substrate. Matter, energy, it doesn't matter. The substrate and its interactions, internally governing how the natural laws emerge. When examining any concept in this framework, its meaning can thus only emerge from the substrate it's said to derive from. Now, what do I mean by meaning? Sense data and functions that occur within the rule space defined by the brain and sense organs. It references entities outside of itself. It can't not. The technical nature of your body defines its own spatial relationship to anything external to itself. Your interaction with physical space is an extension of your own brain experiencing sensations external to the body. When I say that perception is what causes meaning to emerge, I do so by appealing to concepts external to the mind. So, I'm saying it now. Meaning emerges in the mind, which is a physical function of the brain. As such, it can be studied. Meaning is the function defining how an entity is associated in the mind. For example, how duck can refer to a certain genus of waterfowl, an instruction to get someone to lower their physical profile, or even a cloud. These associations do not emerge from the phonemes of duh or k being used in that sequence. Meaning emerges entirely within the association of the resultant word, said association existing entirely within one's own mind. Within materialism's own internal reasoning, meaning can emerge without a mind. These properties are defined purely by mechanistic relationships between concepts and cause and effect, whose associations are predefined and exist without any entity capable of cognition to be able to observe them. Yet this leaves nothing to compare its internal concepts against. Nature doesn't have a defined body and no ability to perceive anything outside of itself. It has no way to study them, and it provides no means of anyone external to it being able to study the concepts themselves. Materialism does not present a concept of meaning that can be studied outside of itself. This should not be construed as an affirmation of idealism either. In common philosophical discourse, materialism and idealism are presented as binary opposites. Therefore, by process of elimination, one may think that disproving of materialism proves idealism. Well, let me tell you something. Materialism and idealism are the same metaphysically. Idealism just replaces matter or energy with mind as the ultimate substrate. Idealism still prescribes meaning onto subjects it is intended to describe, and therefore has no means of being able to describe anything outside of itself. I'll put it simply. Materialism and idealism, that is to say philosophy of body and philosophy of mind, both prescribe meaning as having emerged from their respective substrates. Their properties defined by suspiciously inscrutable forces that govern the substrate itself. These entities are not subject to forces that would alter them from outside of their prescribed meaning. Remember, the substrate is not important. Let me give you an example. I'm sure you, dear viewer, have put on a coat during cold weather at least once. Yet what does it mean for weather to be cold? If one, hypothetically, lived in a 50-degree Fahrenheit room their entire lives, they would lack the experience of the sensation of cold contrasted against warm. Even if they had only read about warm weather, they would still develop a theoretical point of reference for weather when water freezes and when it melts. Coldness, in the context of weather, is experienced and requires not cold weather to contrast itself against. This is because concepts are relational and are understood by contrasting their differences against each other. Yet the materialist perspective would posit that meaning of coldness in weather simply is, citing physical processes that cause the temperature being experienced. What this means is that people simply do not have perspectives or experiences about their environment. This is because within its internal reasoning, all concepts are collapsed into a teleological singularity. Everything has one single meaning, and that meaning is, it happened because of cause and effect. The extent to which change can be said to occur only occurs within the framework of cause and effect. There is only one meaning for everything, and that meaning is static, making it unable to be scrutinized. When I say there is only one meaning, I don't mean it in the objectivist sense of how concepts only have one perspective, because objectivists will claim that any individual concept has one perspective, but these perspectives are different between each other because there's perspectives on different subjects. When I say materialists and idealists have only one meaning for everything, I mean within them there is only one meaning for everything, one that exists completely independently of cognition or perspective. The fact that Celsius, Fahrenheit, Kelvin, and other scales exist to measure increments of temperature demonstrates that multiple meanings can emerge from multiple perspectives on the same topic. Meaning doesn't exist unless perspective exists, which undermines the metaphysical rules of materialism by demonstrating how meaning is evaluated external to cause and effect. For materialism to make sense, the mechanism by which perspective emerges in the first place must be undermined. Thus, materialism implies the third point on the philosophical dark triad, determinism. Since conscious entities are expected to be subject to the natural laws that govern energy and matter, the same expectation must apply to deliberate action. After all, what are humans but fleshy energy? A mind, emerging from the rules defined by the brain, perceives its own existence. Being unable to grasp the true scope of inevitability, a mind has an incomplete understanding of the natural laws, thus creating a perception of choice. For example, one could intend to make a left turn instead of a right turn for reasons that are readily obvious to them, but the same person, with no cause to prefer left or right, will act according to natural laws governing his choice, even if such circumstances from which inevitability emerges exist outside their perception. Put simply, within determinism, they were always going to make the left turn, they just had the illusion they could have turned right. These kinds of minute, imperceptible actions occur constantly in a person's life. What to eat, what to wear, what to say, or even the very thoughts that form in one's own head. How one contextualizes information must be subject to these natural laws. Cognition itself is therefore a function of them, even if the natural laws are not yet fully understood. Even within the circles studying philosophical determinism, there is disagreement about what those natural laws even are. Some claim them to be purely physical laws. Theological representations of determinism also exist. God knowing all energy states and the rules that govern them. Perhaps God is the natural laws. Sometimes it's non-theistic, events predetermined through fate or similar concepts. They would all agree that even if the natural laws aren't fully understood, there are certain components that are known, the laws of thermodynamics, or the law of universal gravitation being two examples. Their properties are known, and the phenomena described by them can be consistently reproduced independent of perception. Science is a developmental methodology, with new discoveries being made seemingly every day, providing narratives regarding observable phenomena whose causes were not known previously or were previously misunderstood. Misunderstandings happen too. The idea is to apply scientific technique to the mind. There are numerous theories on thought and behavior and how it all works. But within determinism, laws exist categorizing the behavior of conscious entities. Much like how materialism proposes the meaning for the movement of energy within a system, determinism proposes meaning for the behavior of a mind, placing these behaviors into categories that define rules of behavior called an archetype. What I mean by archetype is an ideal, a pattern that all similar concepts emulate, and in the context of behavior, a behavioral archetype, well, it constitutes behaviors resembling said archetype. Consider a conservative. When I say someone is conservative, that provokes a narrative within one's mind, relating to the range of thoughts and opinions said conservative is expected to have. One's meaning for conservative emerges from their perspective, which is then projected onto someone identified as conservative. The archetype identified with them centers their perspective around the behavior of other people, around how the ideal conservative acts. Their consciousness and their experiences are replaced by expectations one holds for conservatives, condensing their range of possible thoughts and actions into an already existing narrative. Mind you, that's just one example of one type of behavioral archetype, this one related to politics. Other behavioral archetypes exist: the occupational archetype, racial archetype, national or ethnic archetypes, sexual archetypes, sexuality archetypes, hobbyist archetypes. Any concept where an ideal form is conceptually possible has an archetype. In the case of the behavior of other conscious entities, the archetype's purpose is projecting intent, triggering a physical reaction in the perceptor, dependent on what relationship the archetype has with the perceptor's emotional investments. The maintenance of said investments perceived as necessary to the avoidance of perceived negative consequences. Someone who archetypes as a liberal, for instance, would experience a negative emotional reaction when encountering a conservative. They would perceive the fulfillment of the intent projected onto the conservative as compromising something the liberal is emotionally invested in, even their life, since the emotional investment may be perceived as necessary for survival. The reaction, positive, neutral, or negative, creates confirmation bias regarding action, consolidating perspectives into neat little boxes. representing the boundaries of expected behavior. Those who fall outside of these boxes provoke an emotional reaction as well, similar to one experienced by encountering a rival archetype. You're a monarchist! Actually, I believe that the kingdom should hold elections for who should be the next king or queen. But that's not how monarchies work, stupid! This reaction is provoked when someone demonstrating behavior outside of expectations created by these archetypes triggers a sense of uncertainty. This sense of uncertainty reflects their own personal uncertainty about the archetype they identify themselves with projected outwards. They feel their emotional attachments to the archetypes they've identified with being threatened by the mechanism of archetyping itself being threatened. It's equivocating the archetype itself as the means of achieving said ideal, and if archetyping is conceptually compromised, the ideal is hallucinated to become unachievable. If the whole system of internalized archetypes is threatened, it is hallucinated to be a threat to one's entire personality. When one whose entire identity is just archetypes, well, the big black void where their personality would have been is revealed to be as empty as it is. Archetypes themselves imply an intrinsic quality to one's self, in place of where their sense of self would otherwise be. The meaning and narrative they create about themselves being defined according to the functions they perform. From this understanding, one could gain the impression that a person isn't performing the function of, say, a cashier, the function of a doctor, the function of a Republican voter, or the function of what have you. The functions, actions, traits, etc. become one's entire identity. The identity defines the scope of one's actions, and all of the functions one can or cannot perform, but the meaning of these functions is defined externally. It's what an archetype actually does as a function. See how this works? The same natural laws that enable the laws of thermodynamics to occur independent of observation is presented as applying to behavior. To think otherwise would be to recognize the error in objectivism. Therefore, people who act outside the behavioral norms of their label are treated as behaving wrong. Even if one attempted to get around this through dualism or pluralism, that one cannot study the behavior outside of conscious entities the same way one might study the natural sciences or other topics, the belief in a Socratic truth that predetermines action is what creates these little boxes to begin with. Determinism creates an expectation that people act in a categorizable manner. The fact that people even can behave wrong should suffice to demonstrate that this did not emerge from a coherent theory of knowledge. We know this because if it were physically impossible to behave wrong, then straw manning wouldn't occur, since people's beliefs would always conform to intuitively understandable and universalizable behavioral norms. After all, the universal narrative and universal internalization about an archetype would eliminate any possibility of misunderstanding. Even if one could still behave wrong at all within this framework, it would just have negative consequences. However, said consequences emerge only from people's emotional reactions, which only manifests as consequences through power projection. In other words, political technique. Don't believe me? Try saying the N-word in the south side of Chicago and see how long it takes for people who've internalized certain archetypes to start projecting power onto you. Now, it's interesting to me that Socrates sought to use discourse to discover truth. His metaphysics imply determinism, which is what creates archetyping and therefore strawmanning. The universal perspective, once discovered, eliminates communication, since there would be no alternative perspectives to compare one's own against. His own technique for discovering truth actively works against discourse as a function. I can't imagine he was doing this on purpose, but that's the entailment of his own ideas. But there is one dimension regarding determinism and archetypes that deserves more elaboration. I touched on it before, but consider what it means if archetyping was a valid means of categorizing intrinsic qualities in a person's mind, and we just ignore how intrinsic qualities are unprovable pseudoscience. If they're valid, then it means archetypes frame not just how one sees others, but how one sees themselves. The scope of possible behavior is constrained by these little boxes, and because people have an expectation that the ideal they emotionally attach to is the means for achieving one's valued preferences, behaving wrong becomes not only an external threat, but an internal one. After all, if what one values is idealized by the archetype, then the maintenance of that archetype itself becomes valued. Thus, people with those emotional attachments are incentivized to police their own behavior to conform to those emotional and behavioral patterns as much as they police others' behavior. Can't exactly achieve one's valued preferences through archetypes if archetyping is undermined after all. To be clear, the problem is not archetypes as a concept, and when I use the term, I use it to refer to behavioral archetypes. Archetypes in general are categories useful for building a taxonomy of entities within one's environment. What determinism does is manipulate people into internalizing archetypes within their perception of self, categorizing one's own behavior according to a range that is defined externally, as well as one's own expectations regarding the range of behavior in other people. Oh, you only act that way because you're black. How dare you behave that way? You're supposed to be black. You should act these certain ways because you're Asian, you're Christian, you're atheist, vegetarian, nerd, jock, clumsy. You get the idea. It goes without saying, one can have and internalize multiple archetypes, though what stands out to me is one archetype shared across every person on Earth that I know. One that constrains the behavior of everyone that has ever lived, the archetype of human nature. Projecting the past perspective of what a human is, and those range of behaviors onto the present, constraining behavior into a time capsule. You morons! The time capsule is supposed to be discovered in the future. You're not supposed to lock yourselves into it! Anyways, having a sense of self gives one something to study one's environment against. Otherwise, it can only be studied against itself. As action is just another principle in the natural laws expressing themselves, determinism claims action is categorized. Thus, what emerges from action can be changed through just framing the action differently. You killed all of the children in the orphanage? I was gathering fertilizer for my garden. Anything can be reframed in a propositional framework to take on any meaning. Since within determinism, the function of meaning is not an internal process, but an environmental one. Meaning is subject to this exact same mechanism, as archetypes define a person's identity, and what constitutes an archetype is informed externally. Actually, murder is morally good. For any claim to have meaning as a functional description, it must demonstrate a repeatable pattern outside of perception. This entails studying the environment. Since there is nothing to study the rules of the environment against within determinism, this is impossible. Thus these rules, these natural laws, can only be studied tautologically. You know the drill by now, tautological concepts cannot be studied. The natural laws do not emerge from any actual repeatable phenomena on its own. It's a hallucination, brought upon by an emotional attachment one holds to phenomena believed to emerge exclusively by externally defined categories. The reasoning that brought upon these attachments is projected onto external subjects through the ego and used as a validation mechanism within one's perception. Any deductions or inferences used by that framework appear as a cause and effect relationship when it's not. The challenge in the natural laws challenges the hallucination, which challenges the logical framework that informs a value system that drives the emotional attachment in the first place. If you like something or want something, determinism coerces your ego to make the basis for those preferences the new center of your logic. Any conclusions made from within this reasoning are hallucinated as logical deduction. Take Ferrari, the car manufacturer. Let's say someone likes Ferrari cars. Within determinism, one could say their holding a preference for Ferrari was inevitable. The natural laws working the neurons in one's brain towards an inevitable conclusion. One should know they like Ferraris because they're a gearhead. What's a gearhead? Well, everybody knows gearheads love Ferraris. Therefore, to be a proper gearhead, they have to love Ferraris, and if they prefer other car brands, well, they're just being a gearhead wrong. Within determinism, there is no room for perspective, because there is no perspective, because there is no sense of self. One's perception of a sense of self within this framework is a hallucination induced by the archetypes one identifies with, which is just a fancy way of saying your sense of self, and thus your behavior, is decided by forces external to yourself who define your internalized archetypes. When one's sense of self is informed externally, it becomes impossible to distinguish one's sense of self from the environment. Since no difference is identifiable, it becomes a distinction without a difference. In this way, determinism disallows the concept of the self to emerge, as any behavior can only emerge from the environment. The colloquial understanding of determinism claims choice does not exist. This is only half of what determinism describes. In its full description, choice doesn't exist, but only because there are no entities who can choose. Choice isn't even an illusion, since illusions require an audience to fool. There's no audience, the theater's empty. However, the theater doesn't stay empty. Remember how perception emerges. Sense data enters the brain. For perception to form, cognition occurs as a mechanical function of the brain to represent the sensory stimuli as perception. In other words, cognition causes perception. This causes one to internally develop a set of rules to contextualize sense data, which causes a sense of self to emerge again, because there is a perceptible spatial difference between the environment and the body. Every rule set needs a rules maker after all. Destroying one's sense of self is not only an act of futility, since one will simply emerge once again, but one with profound effects on mental health. Constantly having to relearn one's rules of perception destroys one's sense of certainty about their environment, provoking anxiety. Why wouldn't you be anxious? You'd have no expectation people will learn from their mistakes. That you won't learn from your mistakes. And do you know what that is? It's a lack of hope. This hopelessness and this lack of certainty is characteristic of what in mental health is referred to as masking. While masking does emerge in response to hostile social environments like abusive parents or bullies, tell me, dear viewer, have you ever felt the pressure to change your behavior in, say, government schools or working in customer service? Those environments make you anxious, don't they? This is because social pressures are engineered to incentivize people to suppress or even destroy their sense of self. It's not done out of malice. There's a technical reason for that I promise I'm going to explain. But right now, just consider, if turning everyone into nervous wrecks because they develop a sense of uncertainty about their environment is a problem, then how do we fix this? Well, if sense of certainty only emerges from a sense of self, which emerges out of perspective. Everyone has their own perspective, so teleologically, the certainty must come into existence. If there is only one perspective, then people would just have the one universal perspective and everything would be perfect. And we've looped right back into objectivism. See what happened here? Every component of the philosophical dark triad implies the other, such that even if one presupposes only one of these points to be valid, each node in the framework still implies the others. To review, objectivism claims a single universal narrative that never changes, which implies the materialist narrative that the environment never changes, which implies the determinist view that people never change. As components of other people's environments, therefore only one perspective exists, and that perspective is universal. Within objectivism, nothing can be learned. Within materialism, the environment can't change. Within determinism, people can't change. Therefore, nothing changes. Does this sound familiar at all? This gnawing sense of stagnation in one's life, dissatisfaction with one's current circumstances, yet having an awareness of being unable to do anything about it due to forces that are seemingly beyond one's control or even beyond comprehension? This is a common experience, I think. Extremely common, actually, but that doesn't mean it's normal. Normal in the sense of having emerged as a behavioral norm in society absent external pressures. It's only common because just about all of us are aggressed upon in the same way. Through the emotions and emotional reactions these aggressions provoke, it establishes the rules for our egos that drive us to internalize helplessness, beinglessness, powerlessness, and hopelessness as an emotional supercomplex. I should explain the ego. It's concerned, first and foremost, with the preservation of the body, the flesh suit you wear over the skeleton that lives inside of you. Remember what I said earlier about archetypes? How people internalize the rules of said archetype as a means of achieving the end goal that the archetype's ideal embodies? People form emotional attachments to the supposed goal of these archetypes as the ego latches onto it tricking a person into seeing said archetype as necessary for the body's survival. The rules of reasoning that cause one to internalize said archetype is adapted by the ego. These rules are then used to form a methodology used to study concepts in nature. This causes the brain to hallucinate conclusions arrived from this as logical deduction. Your ego then causes your mind to mistake these hallucinations as accurate representations of the concept. It does this because it's the methodology that was interpreted as what allows the body to live, and the ego only concerns itself with what your mind does to keep your body alive. The self and the body are not the same, keep in mind. A good example of this dynamic in action is, abusive parents. A kid perceives their caretakers as necessary for the survival of their body. Thus, a kid, in order to preserve their sense of certainty, will psychologically blame themselves for their abuse. With determinism subverting a consciousness from developing a coherent sense of self, an ego constructed from the rules of the philosophical dark triad will provoke a fight-or-flight response in someone confronted by information undermining an internalized archetype. The absence of an archetype provoking a sense of uncertainty. But the philosophical dark triad can't provide certainty. There's no method for establishing proof or creating a method for studying concept outside of itself. Materialism claims that the environment is static, so this state of uncertainty is expected to remain. Yet the ego cannot tolerate uncertainty, since that threatens bodily survival. So, a sense of certainty needs to be created to ease the ego, while conforming to the rules of the philosophical dark triad. Thus, the environment cannot be changed, but there is a loophole. By overlaying a new, entirely artificial environment on top of the existing one, a perception of control over said environment can be created. This is ideology. Ideology is functionally a rule set for engineering societies to produce behavioral norms as an environment. Two environments cannot exist in the same space, so one has to displace the other. You can see this in how concrete mountains and asphalt deserts have displaced natural habitats. Ideology manifests behavioral norms that emerges these artificial environments in the first place. If you recall, earlier on I used ideologies as examples of archetypes. Why wouldn't I? Ideology functions as an archetype, adopted by the ego as a means of creating a sense of certainty in one's perception, or at least the illusion of it. As far as perception goes, an illusion is good enough. This illusion is created through the mechanism of people's needs being able to be met through the enforcement of property titles on shelter, a basic need for survival. All ideologies construct some method of property title enforcement within its own internal reasoning. The ego then latches onto this basic need, seeing ideology as necessary to the survival of the body. Hidden from one's perspective, the ego conflates that ideology as the means of one's survival. Oh, but what about Marxism? Within its internal reasoning, it opposes property titles ideologically. Okay, I'll steelman this even further by completely ignoring the technical necessity expressed by states that signal to Marxian ideology within its propaganda models and how they use property title enforcement techniques to exclude civilians from government facilities. After all, we're talking purely about ideology. So yeah, let's go for it. Communal, or common property norm enforcement constitutes behavioral norms expressing an objective perspective regarding how scarce resources ought to be allocated. It's still a property title, just under a regime where they create one singular title that everyone is expected to hold in common. Competing property claims are pressured against, usually through political violence or the threat thereof. So, no. Shifting the narrative doesn't change the nature of ideology. Conservative, liberal, labor, fascist, Zionist, secessionist, Hoppian, all of them. They market themselves differently, abso-frickin-lutely. Without exception, though, all of them are a technique to exploit your ego to make you psychologically dependent on them for your basic needs. To fulfill that need, all of them entangle the enforcement of property titles as necessary for bodily survival, conflating your sense of security of basic needs with technical means that are defined by the ideological archetype. In other words, defined externally by political organizations that enforce property titles. Any organization has overhead costs. Even if it's one guy at his sword, his need to eat is still a logistical concern. As such, the recouping of costs becomes a necessary component of the organization's operation. Taxes being the classical example, though by no means the only one, currency inflation, debt, conquest, fines extracted through the enforcement of legal fanfiction, get creative. Does this sound familiar at all? The expression of political technique through an organization model is called a state. This manifests most commonly through governments, though any organization that relies on the enforcement of property titles to sustain itself, such as a corporation, also does this. They have to, otherwise the artificial environment constructed through property titles that is entailed by ideology cannot sustain itself. The progression of history is replete with organizations utilizing political technique in more sophisticated ways over time. The technical necessity of what is required to maintain the expansion of these political organizations as their populations expand and technology becomes more sophisticated. The reason for this we've touched upon in other videos, so I won't go into that here. As time goes on, the point of reference a person can have of being able to provide their basic needs for themselves becomes perceived as impossible. Artificial environments enforced through political technique replace actual environments, signaling to archetypes internalized within people's minds. Concepts outside of frameworks constructed in ideology frayed from intergenerational memory. As archetypes increase in importance to the state, propaganda becomes ever more prevalent as the means by which political technique is expressed. Not just propaganda itself, but the actions that people are driven towards by propaganda is itself political technique, signaling to people's archetypes, informing them of what it means to be a true Republican, a true socialist, a true rainbowist. You get the idea. It's pretty obvious in modernity, but consider historical proto-propaganda, and how the message to fight for king and country signals to one's own archetype as loyal serf. Hey, those bad guys want to take away my lord's land, and if his land gets taken away, where will I live? What's that? My family? Why, sir, this is the 1300s. I don't care about those leeches. Parents reinforce ideology and archetypes to their hatchlings as a means of reinforcing its validity within their own minds. This occurs even in the absence of government schools. Algorithms on social media actively curate content to appeal to archetypes. These archetypes inform social group formation and the expected modes of behavior. Peers, even friends, reinforce archetypes to each other. Interpersonal relations become consumed by archetypes. Social interaction, reduced social signaling, and virtually every participant is doing this unknowingly. I know it's unwitting because, come on, has anyone else discussed a topic even similar to what I'm bringing up here? The closest example I can think of is the observation of the NPC effect still having relevance in meme culture to this day. Archetypes encouraging social signaling as a default behavioral pattern is what creates the NPC effect. Regardless of intent, the effect has been that interpersonal connection is replaced with social signaling. Virtue signaling is the example most of you might be familiar with. Through propaganda, people become paralyzed by their own beliefs about what's expected of them by their internalized archetype. Political technique takes away our sense of self, then the state sells it back to us. But they don't actually sell us a sense of self. They sell us the Chinese bootleg version as a substitute, the behavioral archetype. They have to, otherwise the people they oppressed to maintain their organizational model wouldn't have externally defined patterns of behavior and thought the state could signal to make themselves look like the good guys. We'd recognize them as the threat to our bodily survival. Thus, they short-circuit our sense of self through our egos, so we perceive them as the means to survival. People have been living under political rule for so long, they mistake social relationships that emerge from power projection and artificial scarcity as something that's emerged naturally. We're told that our world is the result of the archetype called human nature, that it is what it is, and that our anxiety and depression about the world's current state and its future is somehow our fault. Objectivism presents this as the only viable conclusion as, it is what it is, becomes a marketing slogan for promoting the objective perspective about the environment. Materialism means that these environments cannot be changed, and determinism means people can't change. If ideology, conceptually, were a narrative, it would go something like this. The status quo is static, and there's nothing you can do to change it. There is no way to improve yourself or anyone else. All of these problems just are. Life sucks, people suck, and it's always going to be that way because screw you. The most depressing, nihilistic damn piece of narrative ever. Now to be clear, ideology and the state are two entirely separate but related concepts. Ideology presents the theoretical framework, whereas the state is its practical application. It's like the difference between painting a house on canvas and being its architect. When studying how a house functions, one needs to look at it from the perspective of the architect rather than the artist. When studying politics, one will quickly find the technical necessities of what states need to function come into conflict with the ideological framework states appeal to in their propaganda models. Why wouldn't they? Ideology and statecraft require different skill sets, yet ideology sees its expression through the state. In this way, the two need each other. The state provides the ideal for ideologues to strive for, while the state provides the ideologues the illusion of being able to achieve their desired ends. I know it's an illusion, for the reasons of the conflict between theory and practice and political technique I described earlier. The synergy of the two provides a physical demonstration of philosophy in action, however, albeit one that manifests as a variation of the paperclip maximizer. For those of you who don't know, the concept of the paperclip maximizer was invented by Swedish philosopher Nick Bostrom in 2003. The idea is that someone might invent an artificial intelligence with the purpose of producing as many paperclips as possible. The result being a machine that seeks to convert the entirety of the universe, including humans, into paperclips, becoming an existential threat to humanity despite its completely innocuous goal. While this thought experiment demonstrates a threat of unintended consequences, I disagree with the interpretation some might have that a maximization system could only be dangerous because of AI's not understanding intent. I point to the Shirky principle as evidence. If it sounds like I'm going off topic, it's because I'm establishing context for my next point. Now, the Shirky principle is the observation that when people's perceived sense of profit is directly related to a problem existing, they have no incentive to solve that problem. An auto mechanic, for instance, has no incentive to modify cars such that they never need maintenance again, because otherwise there goes their business model. In this sense, certain organizations indirectly become maximizers for their respective problems. Even ones with benevolent purposes like charities, for instance. What worker at a cancer charity is in a hurry to put themselves out of a job? Not many, I think. The implication is that we live in a day and age where cancer maximizers exist. Now, apply the Shirky principle to political technique. The philosophical dark triad creates a sense of uncertainty in the environment. Ideology promises an alleviation of said uncertainty, which manifests as the state. Classic problem-reaction solution. The state, in turn, indoctrinates and propagandizes people into not only being able to understand their environment through the metaphysical framework of objectivism, materialism, and determinism, thus guaranteeing the anxiety that emerges from the sense of uncertainty created, becomes an intergenerational cycle of trauma, inflicted upon us by an organization that is a power maximizer. Enforcing property titles requires power, not just in military force, but also leverage over people's lives. Financial leverage, social pressures, supply chain management, again, the forms this can take are infinite. Political organizations need it, need to be a threat in people's lives that creates in them a greater perception of risk than going otherwise than what the state wishes them to. Otherwise, the US Congress just becomes a glorified retirement home for sociopathic pedophiles rather than an ongoing threat to your life, safety, and sanity. Look, I know Socrates didn't invent the concept of truth. He probably learned it from someone else. I know that others who have never met or are never even aware of each other came up with a similar idea about an objective perspective. But Socrates did popularize it, at least in the West. I know it wasn't his intent to curse humanity with political rule, since states clearly predate him, but this has been the effect of his influence on philosophy, the means by which people can take control of their own mind, their own emotions, and actually begin to develop a theory of knowledge about themselves and their relationship to their environment is subverted as yet another tool for control, a means of subverting consciousness by making the ego the center of one's perspective. This is the effect of politics. Nobody chose this. Hell, I don't even think there was anyone conscious of the implications of politics until us. It was iterated upon over hundreds of years of generations of petty dictators and political technicians competing with each other to discover the most effective and efficient means of oppressing people for maintaining their organizational model. At least, that's what I think. All the while, the cycle of intergenerational psychological abuse induced through the philosophical dark triad metaphysically ablates humanity's sense of self. This is the state and its nature as a power maximizer, its nature as a great filter for civilization, and why it poses an existential threat to humanity. Political technique and its application will drive its agents to seek more and more power until sapience is evolved out of humanity. The end state of political technique being a farm, where one man rules over a farm of billions of mindless beasts. So, yeah, we're dealing with an existential threat to consciousness, no pressure. But I do have good news. We can't beat our enemy without knowing them, and from what I've described, I think I know the enemy, how it works, and what effect it's had on our minds. Believe it or not, that's the hard part. But there's the linchpin that underlies all of this, underlies all of the philosophical dark triad. That linchpin being the proposition that cognition occurs before perception. I know this because at every step of the philosophical dark triad, each component presupposes that conclusions simply exist and are already arrived at before one can even study a concept. There is only one universal perspective in objectivism. The environment and its meaning already exists in materialism, and determinism already claims a means to know exactly how people will act. So, what happens when we remove that pin? I'm not even saying that cognition occurs after perception here, since we're not bound by propositions. Cognition and perception occur simultaneously is also a valid way of subverting that linchpin. The point is, what happens? It means that there is no universal perception. Entities have no universal narrative, so the narrative about them emerges entirely within the minds of those who observe them. These perspectives emerge when the nature of an entity is understood by comparing its properties against a different entity. While subjectivism does reject the concept of truth in the Socratic sense, it fails to subvert objectivism because a universal perspective still emerges. It's just one that's internal rather than shared by all. It still creates the implication that one's environment and people are all static, recreating materialism and determinism. This is how you get egoism. To actually subvert objectivism, recognize that any claim about a universal perspective is tautological, and therefore scientifically indistinguishable from gibberish. The patterns you perceive in your environment inform how you navigate the pressures of said environment. Comparing perspectives gives you the most points of reference possible for finding patterns in how entities relate to each other, even causing entirely unique perspectives to emerge. A coherent theory of knowledge can only form by studying subjects according to relations, rather than by their rules. Materialism presupposes that meaning emerges entirely from an entity's substrate. Idealism doesn't subvert it, it merely changes the substrate. Its actual subversion is the recognition that meaning emerges from cognition, perceiving relationships between subjects of perception, including the perceptor. In light of new context, social and environmental pressures, and knowledge, these relationships are always subject to change. Patterns in perception change as well. Consciousnesses are subject to change too, which is how we subvert determinism. The story goes that Diogenes went to the marketplace with a lamp, or candle depending on who you ask. He went searching for an honest man, but couldn't find one. Not because he perceived the people of his city to all be liars, but because honesty is not an intrinsic quality in anyone. In fact, nothing is intrinsic. Diogenes' point was that people are not inherently honest. Honesty is performative. The honest man does not exist. There are only men and women who perform the act of honesty. Similarly, there is no such thing as a dishonest man. You, dear viewer, are not a conservative. You are not a cashier, a nerd, or any kind of archetype. You are someone who performs those functions, those acts, or maybe you perform entirely different functions. But by framing others and yourself as performing functions rather than simply being the function or the action, it places yourself and others as agents of your own wills. This short-circuits the function that archetyping has within your mind. Other people aren't X. They're performing the function or action of X. You aren't X either. What are you? Who are you? That's a function of the study of yourself and your relation to the environment that constructs and sharpens one's sense of self rather than ablates it. Hold on. By your reasoning, libertarianism and anarchism are archetypes. That also means you're not an anarchist by your own reasoning, Mr. Heretic. Oh, this is going to get taken so out of context. But yes, that is correct. I am not an anarchist. I am performing the act of anarchy. If the philosophical dark triad performs the function of demolishing consciousness, then its subversion must bolster consciousness. Objectivism, universalism, and its various permutations eliminate perception. Post-objectivism or post-universalism facilitates perspective. Materialism and its metaphysical permutations like idealism, monism, or pluralism eliminate meaning. Post-materialism nurtures the emergence of meaning in one's mind. Determinism destroys the self. Post-determinism must enhance it. 4 years ago, at the time of this recording, I made the video, Authoritarianism Starts at Home. It was an exploration into how cyclical abuse reinforces itself through parenting, psychologically conditioning hatchlings to grow into adults who use political technique to get what they want. I didn't describe it in those terms, but that's how I would frame the topic knowing what I know now. In a way, this video is a follow-up to that one. I would call it Authoritarianism Starts in the Ego. Because many parents utilize political technique when interacting with their own kids through power projection, they, being the kids, internalize political technique as a norm in behavior in interpersonal relationships. They reproduce this in their lives. When they come of age, what they will have learned is how to appease those with social power and how to hide from them. To those they hold social power over, usually their own kids, they have no qualms about projecting power themselves. Thus, the emotional state of people within this artificial environment constructed through ideology is trauma. Minds that emerge will only ever be traumatized and will seek to reproduce trauma as the basis for social norms. It's a cycle that continually reproduces itself and that any one person is powerless to stop, until the technical mechanism for the creation and continuation of this cycle is done away with. Your trauma causes you to reproduce these techniques because it produces norms of behavior for yourself that emerge outside your perception. Whether or not there is anyone in any government who has even half of the context I presented in the video, the fact that the state puts so many resources into propaganda should reveal the importance of defining the rules that govern your perception to them. From a purely technical perspective, it is in their interest for you to be traumatized and to traumatize in turn. In order for the state to exist, it has to traumatize you, and any relationship one has with it will only ever be abusive. Even if every politician and bureaucrat retired tomorrow or were violently overthrown, the environmental pressures that reproduce ideology and political technique create the so-called power vacuum that allows for another state to just pick off where the last one left off. The Roman Empire never ended. It just changed, evolved, and reproduced itself in the bodies of new societies, adapting to new social settings like an infection. To fight the empire is to be infected by its derangement. This is a paradox. Whoever defeats the empire becomes the empire. It proliferates like a virus, imposing its form on its enemies. Thereby it becomes its enemies. If you don't believe me, just look at government buildings or monuments in the West and their eagerness to reproduce Greco-Roman architecture. Academia, the media, social network platforms, corporations, all appendages of the state that operate like cults, isolating people from themselves and each other through archetyping, brainwashing them through the Socratic method, and inculcating feelings of helplessness and hopelessness through materialism. The result is a mass-produced man, fearful, anxious, coping with the perceived immutability of the environment, incapable of thinking and acting than otherwise the schoolmasters, corporate bosses, content moderators, and ruling overlords would wish them to. It's no coincidence that the internal organization structure of a school, a corporation, a hospital, a military, and a prison is virtually identical. If the state is a disease, then we cure it. To cause the condition of freedom to emerge, we gotta break the cycle. State-sponsored cyclical abuse doesn't have to dictate our behavior or our relationships because we've defined how it works. We know how it works because our perceptions have something external to it to compare our behavior against, our sense of self. From simply identifying this and studying its implications, we are free. And you can be too. To break this cycle, examine the cause of your behavioral patterns and take conscious control of them. Determine if your actions are a result of conscious choice or unconscious ego. Manage your own cognition because you are not a function. You are a person with will and agency. You certainly do perform a function, even if that function is as a cog in someone else's machine. But you are just that, a person performing the function of the cog. You are not a cog. You are what is left when you remove all of the archetypes, all of the abstractions from your mind, and all of the functions that you've internalized as part of your identity. Because there is a metaphysical conflict for your mind, one that is occurring outside our perception and has been ongoing for thousands of years. I can only hope any of the information I've presented here can help you better identify these mechanisms within yourself and what drives your emotional reactions and behavioral patterns. I know I've been very abstract so far, and I've thrown a lot of concepts at you, so I'll keep the summation simple. If you want to be free, then you have to think like a free person. If you want to think like a free person, then kill your ego. Questions, comments, critique? Yes, I know, it's been a long time since I made a video, a lot of stuff's been going on. Plus, I am reasonably sure we've been making new discoveries at such a rapid pace, this video will be obsolete come mid-2025. Anyways, yeah. Thanks for doing the thing, see you next time.